War in Yemen, war in Syria, confrontation with Iran, a diplomatic crisis with Qatar, and now to top it all off, the coronavirus crisis and the devastating collapse in oil prices. The Persian Gulf countries have been living on the brink of a nervous breakdown for a few years now, and we're talking about some of the richest countries in the world, at least given the immense fortunes that the royal families that govern these countries control. Look, for example, at this chart from the consulting firm Oliver Wyman. In early 2020, the consulting firm estimated that the 6 countries that make up the Persian Gulf Cooperation Council, namely Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain, and Qatar, controlled assets worth almost a staggering $44 trillion. Yes, trillions. $3.3 trillion invested through its sovereign wealth funds, and just over $40 trillion in oil and natural gas reserves. To give you an idea, that works out to more than 1.3 million per inhabitant. This is a huge source of wealth that these countries could use to maintain very high living standards, modernize their economies, and maintain significant global influence. However, the coronavirus crisis has turned all these forecasts upside down and left us with news like this.
Jobless migrants flee oil-rich countries to the chagrin of their home countries. Legions of foreign workers are leaving Gulf nations. Wall Street Journal.
So, what is going on in the petro-monarchies and in the Persian Gulf? What sort of future do they face? Is their story of money, riches, and power coming to an end? Which countries will be most affected? In this video, we will answer all these questions, but first, we will answer a question that many of you must have asked yourself more than once. Why on earth should I care what happens in a part of the world where there's little more than deserts and camels? Why should we care what happens in the Persian Gulf? Well, let's find out. Virtually every economy in the world is suffering from the effects of SARS-CoV-2, and certainly the countries in the Persian Gulf are no exception. Of course, they are facing a double crisis. On one hand, like most countries, they have to put in place social distancing and confinement measures and to close public spaces and businesses. On the other hand, they're dealing with a huge fall in oil prices that has been a direct result of the sudden and unprecedented collapse in demand. To give you an idea, during the first 5 months of 2020, the price of oil fell by almost 50%, and that's despite these countries cutting production. And of course, rock bottom prices and lower production means far less revenue for Gulf petro-monarchies. The amounts involved are so large that more than a couple of you would be left speechless. But why should we care about all this? Well, let's say that from a geostrategic point of view, the Persian Gulf countries are much more important than we might think at first glance, and their importance is based on these 3 factors. Okay, so the first one I'm sure you are very clear about. This region is home to the largest oil and natural gas deposits on the planet. Approximately 35% of all oil produced in the world comes from the Persian Gulf. But that's not all. The second reason this part of the world is so important is because of its key in world trade. It's usually something that goes unnoticed, but this area of the world is a key hub for the world's busiest sea and air routes. Most routes connecting Asia, Africa, and Europe pass through here. That explains why some of the largest ports and airports on the planet are located in this region. But if you want a more concrete example, check this out. 18% of all global rice production, 16% of all wheat production, and 30% of the fertilizer trade passes through this region. And of course, if instead of rice or wheat we talk about Chinese manufacturing, the situation is not dissimilar.
We need the Middle East not for its oil, but precisely because it sits in the middle of a global market that secures our global energy supply. And even more important, because the Middle East facilitates the transit of the goods that we and other countries use to grow. Karen E. Young, a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute.
And then finally, we cannot forget the enormous religious and social weight these countries have in the Muslim community around the world. In a nutshell, those are the 3 reasons why the Persian Gulf is so important. And let's not forget that these countries have some of the largest reserves of money in the world. We're talking about almost $3.5 trillion petrodollars. That is, these countries alone could put the entire world's financial books in order. Now that's really saying something. However, in spite of everything, the last few years have not exactly been good for any of these countries, and now the coronavirus threatens to be the last straw. In this video, we're going to focus on the 6 countries that make up the Persian Gulf Cooperation Council, but if we also take Iraq and Iran into account, then the result could be even worse. But how are things really in this part of the world? When we say that the last few years have been bad, what exactly do we mean? What is the real scale of the problem? Let's take a look.
A waning fortune.
Okay, it's not the same to face a problem with almost $3.5 trillion in your pocket than it is without them. The Gulf Sheikh's wallet is still full. However, this huge stash of cash might be hiding a new reality. We could be looking at one of those situations where you can't see the forest for the trees. Now let me explain. According to data from the International Monetary Fund, in the last 4 years alone, the net financial assets held by the 6 Persian Gulf monarchies have been reduced to $500 billion. And that's not all. This year, all these countries are expected to close with double-digit deficits. In 2020 alone, the sheikhs are going to lose more than $220 billion over the course of a year. And I know what some of you are thinking, come on Josh, $220 billion? That's rough, but they will still have more than $3 trillion in their pocket. What's the problem? Well, if you think like this, you're not taking into account some of the finer details. For example, the IMF has estimated that if things don't change dramatically, the Gulf petro-monarchies will see their enormous financial wealth just disappear in just over a decade. And take note, because we are talking about money that is supposedly meant to ensure the economic viability of countries that have a very young population, a lack of jobs, and which today remain completely dependent on the price of oil. This dependence is the reason why these countries have launched all kinds of multi-million-dollar projects to try and diversify their economies and generate new sources of wealth over the past 2 decades. In the early 2020s alone, real estate mega projects in the Gulf accumulated committed investments worth almost $1 trillion. Now, we are talking about megaports, new cities built from scratch, stadiums, resorts, etc., etc. However, such initiatives have generally had disappointing outcomes. A lot of money have been spent to get rather poor results. And to top it all off, now, because of the coronavirus, projects built over the last few years promise to reap huge losses. You see, the mighty petro-monarchies in the Gulf now face an uncertain future. They have to maintain a high standard of living with dwindling fortunes, very young cities with high rates of population growth, and ever-increasing levels of unemployment. If the crisis and oil prices do not recover soon, these countries could have a very hard time. Of course, not all countries are the same. Saudi Arabia, for example, is one of the countries that could suffer the worst over the next few years. Let's take a look.
Great power with leaden feet.
According to news headlines during the coronavirus crisis, we might think that Saudi Arabia is calmly taking advantage of the chaos to build its strength.
Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund buys stakes in Facebook, Boeing, Cisco Systems, Wall Street Journal.
A bargain hunter who has even just bought a football team.
Saudi Wealth Fund agrees to £300 million deal to buy Newcastle United, Financial Times.
However, hold on a moment, because the reality is very, very different. In the last decade, Saudi Arabia has tried to become a superpower. Over the past 10 years, this country has had the 3rd largest military budget in the world, behind only the United States and China.
$3 billion, $533 million, $525 million. That's peanuts for you. Should have increased it.
It has triggered its own war in Yemen and has had a very heavy-handed foreign policy. The blockade of Qatar and the conflict with Iran have been good evidence of this. And as you can imagine, these whims have not been cheap. Since 2015, Saudi Arabia's public deficit has averaged nearly 11% each year. This has caused the government's reserves, the Saudi treasury, to have shrunk by more than $200 billion, whilst public debt has increased 5-fold, from 5 to 25% of GDP. And now coronavirus and the collapse in the oil price are going to cause the 2020 deficit to far exceed $100 billion. That is, at this rate, in just over 3 years, all accumulated oil wealth could disappear, be gone completely, and that would create a very difficult hole to plug because the Saudi economy basically depends on public spending.
We will reduce expenditure, if God wills, even if some of the steps taken will be painful, but they are for the benefit of everyone, for the benefit of the country, and for the benefit of the citizens. Mohammed Al-Jadaan, Finance Minister of Saudi Arabia.
And that's precisely what they've done. So far, the Saudi government has already announced that it will triple the tax on purchases, VAT, from 5% to 15%. It will also cut employee pay by $270 a month and put on hold many of the investment projects the country had launched to try and diversify its economy. However, none of this may be enough. In Saudi Arabia, the vast majority of society lives directly or indirectly from public spending, and that way of life is what maintains stability and loyalty to the Saudi royal family, the ruling royal family. The government understands that in this case, the cuts have a limit. But what does this situation mean for the future? Well, I think we can say that the long-term scenario could be very good or very bad for the rest of the world. Let me explain. With a very young population and an unemployment rate that will soon exceed 15%, the crisis may force the Saudis to reform the country from top to bottom, which would be reasonably good, or in contrast, it may fuel the discourse of the most radical religious leaders, as was the case in the 1990s. And that would be bad. Something really bad for everyone. But Saudi Arabia is not the only country with problems. Even places as rich as Kuwait or Dubai now face severe turbulence. Take a look.
The pearls of the Gulf.
Until it was invaded by Saddam Hussein's troops in 1990, Kuwait was considered the pearl of the Persian Gulf. A stable, tremendously rich country with some of the most advanced institutions in the region. Indeed, Kuwait's political system is considered akin to a parliamentary monarchy. All adult men, and since 2006, also women with Kuwaiti nationality, have the right to vote. Every 4 years, a unicameral parliament is elected that appoints the prime minister, passes laws, oversees the government, and approves budgets. And it's also a tremendously rich country. It's basically a small state that sits on gigantic oil fields. To give you an idea, while the population with Kuwaiti nationality amounts to just over 1 million inhabitants, proven crude oil reserves exceed 100 billion barrels, the 6th largest reserves on the planet. A situation in which this small country has managed to create a huge sovereign wealth fund, the Kuwait Investment Authority, which has invested more than $500 billion worldwide, stocks, real estate, debt, gold, and perhaps that's also why it's the Gulf country that has made the least effort over the past few decades to diversify its economy, to such an extent that today more than 90% of the government's total revenue depends directly on black gold. And therefore, it follows that if the price of oil sinks, you can already imagine what happens to the accounts of this small country. Between failing oil prices and the government plans to deal with the coronavirus crisis, the National Bank of Kuwait, one of the largest local banks, has predicted that the public deficit will be 40% of GDP in 2020. Yes, that's right, 40% of GDP. Clearly, his situation is very different from that of Saudi Arabia. Their reserves of money and oil per capita are much larger, but even this country has problems. With a rapidly growing population, Kuwait increasingly needs higher oil prices to balance its budgets. Meanwhile, the other great pearl of the Gulf, Dubai, also faces serious problems. Although Dubai is not so dependent on oil, the problem has been the collapse of tourism and commercial activities, the two great areas in which this city specializes. A city that counts among its assets the largest international airport in the world, one of the largest airlines, the largest shopping center, the most luxurious hotel, and one of the 10 largest ports on the planet. Giant projects that have essentially been financed with debt. To give you an idea, according to the consulting firm Capital Economics, Dubai's sovereign debt amounts to 110% of GDP, while the debt of public companies is another 80%. In total, almost 200% debt over GDP. And now the coronavirus is making news like this.
70% of Dubai companies expect to go out of business within 6 months due to coronavirus pandemic, survey says. CNBC.
And this is something that adds to a situation that was already fragile. As we mentioned earlier, Dubai's economy has been pretty bad for a few years. For example, since 2014, property prices have fallen by 30%. And that's not all. Now the city faces a whole exodus of expats that will reduce its population, which creates another problem. A lower population means less occupied housing, less consumption, etc.
We are facing a minimum population contraction of 10% during 2020. Nasser Al-Sheikh, former head of Dubai's finance department.
Of course, Dubai keeps an ace up its sleeve. They can always phone a friend, like back in 2009, when their comrade and neighbor Abu Dhabi, the richest emirate in the world, came to their aid and lent Dubai all the money that they needed. Of course, the question that many may ask is, what will Abu Dhabi ask in return? What trade-offs will it demand? Can Dubai reinvent itself again? Anyway, this is the situation that the petro-monarchies of the Persian Gulf are going through today. As you can see, coronavirus has wreaked havoc, even in some of the richest places on Earth. And the question is, will these countries manage to reinvent themselves? Can they escape their oil addiction? Leave your answer in the comments. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit like if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Don't forget to check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals of this episode, that weren't mine. Also, this channel is possible because of Patreon, and our patrons on that platform. Please consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.
If you want to learn more about politics and world affairs and hear some more of my lovely voice, come check out the Reconsider podcast, where we don't do the thinking for you. Find Reconsider at www.reconsidermedia.com or on Apple or Google Play or your favorite podcatcher.